Bumblebees. This is one of my favorite subjects. I have about 14 honeybee hives on our property, and so it is very dear and important to me. But bumble and all beneficial insects. And so this presentation, Bumblebees in the Salish Sea and Impacts on Black-tailed Deer by Kephra Beckett. Kephra Beckett is a passionate researcher and conservatist with a deep interest in island ecology. Growing up on Salt Spring Island, she's always had a keen interest in exploring the worlds of plants and insects around her, developing a profound appreciation for interconnectedness of all elements within our ecosystem. Kephra finds a great satisfaction in working on projects that tackle real-world issues. This led her to join Dr. Tara Martin's Conservation Decisions Lab at the University of BC, a lab which emphasizes the use of scientific knowledge to make informed decisions and prioritize action-based solutions. Last year, Kephra completed her Master's of Science, where she studied the impacts of overpopulated deer on bumblebees in the Salish Sea. Kephra now works at BC Nature, where she leads her Municipal Protected Areas project, while also continuing to work on deer management solutions. And I would like Kephra, please, if you could, are you there?
Yes, hi.
Excellent. Hello, Kephra. I just didn't see your picture there.
No problem. I'm just going to share my screen here. How does that look? Can I get a thumbs up from someone? Okay, good. Okay, hi everybody. My name's Kephra. Thank you for that introduction. I'm really happy to be joining you today and discuss my recent master's research. Just expanding a little bit on that background you just received. I grew up on Salt Spring, but specifically, I really liked spending a lot of time in Garry Oak and associated ecosystems. There is a lookout near my parents' place that I have always loved going on a walk to and spending a lot of time thinking about the different relationships between everything that lives there. It appeared to me at the time that it was just a natural savanna of very few flowering plants, and I naively thought that this was how they had always been. I had never really thought about if things were in balance until I joined Dr. Tara Martin's lab and started learning more about the history of these places and thinking about how the relationships were playing out. So, as you can probably tell from the title of this talk, most of the work took place in the Salish Seas, and that is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of a multitude of Coast Salish peoples. And we know that these waters have hundreds of islands spread throughout it. And many of these islands are home to much of the remaining Garry Oak and associated ecosystems in BC, which have been stewarded by First Nations through cultural burning, harvesting of large herbivores, and planting of root gardens for millennia, which has led to these areas being considered ecocultural landscapes. They're also home to over 100 species at risk, but unfortunately less than 5% of its original extent remains. But we think that that number is actually probably even smaller as we're learning more and more about what the historical extent of these places were. I know this is review for a lot of people, but just wanted to cover that so that we're all on the same page. So moving on to one of the key players in these ecosystems that everybody I'm sure here knows a lot about is the black-tailed deer. And this is a native species to the area. Historically, their levels were kept at much lower levels through natural predation as well as hunting, but now they're considered hyperabundant. So they are at such a high population level that they're having a negative impact on the ecosystems they're part of. Unfortunately, there's no systematic management for them currently. There's small pockets on some of the islands of kind of small scale programs, but nothing widespread enough to be keeping their numbers at a low enough level. And so previous research has shown how they are having negative impacts on native plant communities as well as songbirds. But nobody had really looked at their impact on pollinators around here until I started doing my master's. So coming in, I really wanted to learn more about the pollinators of the Gulf Islands. Growing up, I have been a bug girl my whole life. And so I really wanted to learn more about the pollinators, not just because I think they're cute and amazing, but also they're really essential for pretty much all terrestrial ecosystems. And we know that they're in decline in a lot of cases. There's more and more evidence coming out about the importance specifically of wild pollinators, and bumblebees are a great example of that, in that they can pollinate in heavier winds, they can increase pollination efficiency when paired with honeybees, and they can also provide greater pollination of native vegetation. Unfortunately, they're under threat from many different stressors, from pathogens, land cover change, climate change, pesticide use. It's a death by 1,000 cuts, unfortunately. And without them, we risk the loss of native ecosystem functioning and crop production. Even though they're so essential for most terrestrial ecosystems, and especially Garry Oak ecosystems, I was surprised when I started my research that there wasn't actually a lot of information about what species were found on a lot of the remote rural islands around Salt Spring. We thought that maybe some of these more remote islands may be providing refugia for the wild pollinators. So that was part of the reason why we really wanted to start learning about what was out there. So bringing it back, a lot of these questions were based on the relationship between deer, the plant community, and then the bumblebees that rely on them. So we believe that deer are probably about 10 times higher levels than they were historically. And so I wanted to specifically find out how that's impacting pollinators. So for the first half of my master's, I focused on two main questions. First, establishing a baseline of what bumblebee species are present on these small islands, and then figuring out if the browsing of deer is impacting them. So this led to a really fun field season in the summer of 2021, where me and my colleague, Abby Sherwood there, got to go out and boat around in the Salish Sea. We had an experimental design where we went out to 10 islands, half that have deer present on them and half that don't, to be able to compare the impacts of the deer. And so at each site that we visited, we did floral stem counts. So we had a 1 by 1 meter quadrat here and we counted all of the flowering stems within it. I did a bumblebee count visually of all of the bumblebees in the site that were actively foraging. And we also did a deer pellet count. So pretty much just counting deer poo to see how many deer were in that site. Okay, so expanding on some of those photos that you saw before, here's just kind of a snapshot of the stark difference between an island with and without deer. On the left-hand side, we have Salt Spring Island, which has a very high deer population. And then on the right-hand side, we have Susquehanna, also known as Halibut Island, which has no deer. And you can see there's pretty much a buffet of flowers on Susquehanna and not much available on Salt Spring. When we looked at the deer densities based on our pellet counts, we found that it ranged from about 0.8 to 1.7 deer per hectare. And just to put that into context, we believe that historical levels were more around 0.08. So this is vastly higher than what these systems are used to. And furthermore, we compared that to some recent studies done on these same islands, where they also calculated deer density, and our values were actually even higher than those previous studies. The reason we think is because those previous studies were done in a different ecosystem type. So this is showing evidence that deer are actually preferentially spending more time in Garry Oak ecosystems. Okay, moving on to the floral community results. So if you're not familiar with a graph like this, just know that any point that's closer to one another means that their floral community is more similar. And so the points that are farther apart have more dissimilar communities. What we can see here is that there's a clear grouping of islands with deer, indicated by this yellow color, compared to islands that have no deer by this bluish color. So we can see that the floral communities are more similar within islands that have deer or don't have deer, rather than between each other. Then when we pop in the actual plant species that are associated with each island, we can see that the majority of plant species that were found on islands without deer are native, whereas the majority of plant species associated with deer present islands are exotic. Okay, now moving on to the bumblebee counts. So here's just a bar graph of the average number of bees that I would count during each visit. I'm going to direct your view to the last bar here, which is all of the species combined. And basically what we found was that there were more than twice as many bees found on islands without deer than islands with deer. And if we look at each individual species, that trend is pretty much reflected within each, except for the yellow-faced bumblebee. But I'm not going to dive into that now, but if anyone has questions, we can talk about that later. Okay, now tying this all together, I put all of the variables that I measured when visiting each site into a model. So there's different factors that can be impacting if bumblebees are out, such as temperature or wind speed, different elements of the weather. So I wanted to keep track of all of those and make sure that they were being considered. So what to keep in mind when looking at this diagram: the black arrows indicate a positive relationship, and the red arrows indicate a negative relationship. But mainly, I just want you to look and see that the value for deer is astronomically higher of an impact on how many stem or how many flowers we counted compared to any other variables. And so we can see that deer are having a huge impact on how many flowers we counted, and that the more flowers we counted, the more bumblebees we saw. So taking that together, we know that deer are having an indirect negative impact on bumblebees. Okay, so in conclusion for this part of my project, I found that Garry Oak and associated ecosystems face heightened stress from black-tailed deer, that the deer are reducing floral resources overall, but especially of native plants, and that bumblebee abundances are much lower on islands with deer. So all of this kind of draws us to a conclusion that I'm sure many of you have reached before, is that we need some form of deer management for these islands. But each area has to have kind of a unique setup based on the needs of the area and the community. So in our case, we need something that's consistent. We're talking about managing a native species, so we need something long-term. We also need something that's community focused, that considers equity and the needs of all of the different members of the community and their concerns. And as I'm sure you all know, this is a pretty contentious subject. So we need the decision-making process to be very transparent so that people can understand why we're coming to the conclusions that we are. Finally, we need something that's feasible. We're talking about a lot of small islands that are sometimes difficult to access. And at the same time, we're talking about deer that can swim between islands. So it makes a pretty tricky situation. Altogether, this is a pretty hairy problem. And when we have hairy problems in conservation, we can turn to what's called a structured decision-making process, which, so a structured decision-making framework combines multiple different tools and opinions in a formalized procedure that helps us decompose and work through the problem in a logical and transparent way. So my framework that I chose was to follow what's called the PROACT framework. And so that is just an acronym that stands for these 5 steps here. And for each of these 5 steps, I got the input and advice from many different experts in the field of deer management, restoration, people that have experience with deer hunting, different stakeholders and title holders, as many different perspectives as possible. And we worked through all of these steps together in different workshops. One of which was one that was held at Stoll Lake Farm a few months ago. So this was a workshop put on by Tar Martin, and the whole thing wasn't necessarily just about deer management, but there was one day where a subset of us came out and discussed the deer management problem. So I'm just going to quickly go through these steps. We came up with a bit more of a specific definition, but basically it boiled down to what deer management strategies would work the best for the Gulf Islands. And we wanted to note that there's different objectives related to this problem. It's not just an ecological problem, but we need something that is socially minded as well as something that is feasible. So, keeping those objectives in mind, all of the experts came up with a long laundry list of different ways that we could solve this problem. And rather than spending all of our time discussing each one, we kind of came up with our 5 top choices that we wanted to spend more time discussing and thinking about. And those were Indigenous-led hunting. So that would be a guardianship program with the different Coast Salish nations, not just hunting, but also the meat processing side of things, and as well as a large focus on education to their youth on how to do these practices. Another one was contract hunting, not necessarily done by First Nations. And the third was increasing licensed hunting. So we know that people already hunt in the area, but there are some limitations such as bag limits. So thinking about lowering the barriers for the people that are already hunting. And the fourth idea was improving predator viability. So first, the original idea was, what if we just introduce some natural predators back into the system? But for a number of different reasons, we came to the conclusion that that just wasn't going to work for the Gulf Islands. So instead, we came up with this predator viability option, where it was more about educating the public to become more comfortable with coexisting with predators that are naturally coming into the system on their own. And then the final individual strategy was birth control, because we know that that has been going on a little bit in Oak Bay on Vancouver Island. So we wanted to explore that as well. On top of that, we came up with different complementary strategies that were combining some of these together. So once we came up with all of the strategies, all of the experts first estimated how well they would do in meeting our objectives individually. And then we came back together as a group and discussed our ideas, had some time to reflect and maybe rethink the way we were thinking about things, and gave everyone a chance to revise their estimates if they wanted. So I just want to say that this is preliminary work. I'm not done through all of these expert elicitations, but based off of the ones that have been going on so far, it seems to be that people think the 2 best options are likely Indigenous-led hunting, or the combination of Indigenous-led hunting and additional contract hunting and improved predator viability. What seems very clear from all of the input is that birth control is just not going to work. There are some cultural concerns about not being able to hunt and consume the meat if people know that part of the population has had birth control administered to it. There's also issues around having to recapture animals every couple of years you have to re-administer birth control. And so there's some feasibility and also just kind of some animal cruelty concerns associated with that. So all in all, taking kind of the bee side of things and then the deer management side of things, I want to just conclude that we found that deer hyperabundance is truly impacting plant and pollinator communities. We can see that management is most likely to happen when both social and environmental needs are considered together. So this isn't just an environmental problem. We need to think about all aspects of it. And so the next steps that I'm excited about are to complete that expert elicitation process that I'm talking about. We're currently working on a paper right now to outline some of the ideas and recommendations, and hopefully that will lead to implementation. So I'm going to end it there and just throw out my email if anyone wants to contact me. And yeah, happy to answer any questions that people may have.